Hello again, my lovely little horrorlings. Gather round. Mama's got some more stories to tell you tonight. So, this story didn't happen to me, but I heard it many times when I was growing up. My grandparents owned 80 acres, about 20 miles east of Snowflake, Arizona. They had moved to the land in the early 80s after my grandfather had retired from the mine in San Manuel, Arizona. The land was pretty barren. I don't know why they chose to buy it. Red sandstone bluffs and dry washes cut across the landscape, dotted with juniper and cedar trees. And red sand was everywhere. I suppose at that time the land was cheap. They didn't have close neighbours. The closest was about a mile away, and that was my aunt and uncle. The next closest neighbour was a man named Stoddard. I never got his first name, just Stoddard. He lived about 4 miles from my grandparents at the base of one of the sandstone bluffs. He was an a-hole rancher from what my grandparents said. He thought he owned everything and was entitled to do whatever he wanted. More than once my grandpa caught Stoddard cutting my grandfather's barbed wire fence to let his cattle onto my grandpa's land to graze. Now, this area is full of ancient Anasazi Pueblo ruins. Most of them have been destroyed by ranchers with backhoes trying to find pots to sell. I'm sure Stoddard was one of them. So, the story goes, one day, after losing a calf, Stoddard stumbles upon a cave, sealed by a giant slab of sandstone against one of the sides of the bluff. Curious about it, he used a backhoe to remove the boulder. After going inside, he discovers it's an Anasazi burial cave. I'm sure he was delighted. He starts taking things from the burial cave and selling them. Well, from that moment on, he's had some pretty bad luck. First, he lost about $500,000 on the stock market. Then his cattle all began to get a disease and die. In financial ruin, he gets yet another blow. His wife was diagnosed with an extremely rare disease, and then she passes away also. Then Stoddard gets thrown from his horse and loses his ability to walk, and this all happens within a couple of years. He tells everyone he knows that he's cursed from the Anasazi burial. They laugh it off. Stoddard puts all the artifacts back that he still has and seals the cave back up with the boulder. He abandons all his belongings and leaves one night. This is the late 1980s. Fast forward a couple of years since Stoddard abandoned his ranch house, the land and the house are bought by a man from California. He puts the ranch house up for rent. My aunt is pregnant with her first son and decides to move from San Manuel to Snowflake to be closer to her parents. Stoddard's house is fully furnished. My aunt and her husband move in. He finds a job working nights at the local paper mill. It's very creepy out there at night. At first it seems like a nice little place, creepy at night but not too bad. And then weird stuff starts happening. My aunt starts hearing faint chanting and drums at night. She brushes it off. She had a hippie neighbour who lived about a mile away up the bluff, so she figures it must just be them doing hippie stuff. But she can't help but feel like someone or something is always watching her, all the time. She starts having nightmares every night, but chalks it up to being alone and pregnancy hormones. She finally tells my grandpa about it, and he loans her his dog to keep her company at night. She drives the dog out there, but he refuses to get out of the truck, the hair on his back straight up and growling. She gets freaked out, but figures maybe he saw a rabbit or something. So she picks him up and hauls him into the house. The dog just stares at the door and growls. That night he growls and barks all night. The drums and the chanting are louder. The next morning my aunt finds human bare feet footprints all around the house. So this goes on for about a week. The dog barks and growls at night. She has nightmares when she does sleep and finds footprints around the house each morning. The chanting and the drums keep getting louder. Finally, she feels like she's losing her mind, so she asks my grandma to come over and stay the night with her. Grandma is more than happy to do so. So after finishing her chores, she heads over, planning to make my aunt a nice meal. This is the late afternoon. My aunt lays down for a nap, comfortable now that my grandma is there with her. My grandma decides to take a little walk at the base of the bluff. My grandma was a very religious person. She was active in the church and devoted her life to Jesus. As she was out on her little walk, she likes to look for pottery shards or arrowheads. A little ways from the house, she gets a very unnerving feeling that something is watching her. She said it made her skin crawl. She could just sense something evil. So my grandma prays and walks back to the house. She decides not to say anything to my aunt, even though she's still awake, because my aunt is already frightened. It would just make it worse. Instead, she tells my aunt that maybe it's a better idea for them both to go and stay at her house tonight. My aunt agrees, and by the time my aunt gets her stuff together, the sun is just about to go down behind the bluff. My grandma, my aunt, and the dog all load up in the pickup. My grandma turns the key, and nothing. She tries again. Nothing. Not being very mechanically inclined, Grandma goes into the house to call Grandpa, but he doesn't answer. She remembers he was going into town this afternoon. Dang. So they unload and go back into the house, waiting for Grandpa to get home. It's night now. No moon. Pitch dark. The dog begins its low growl. The sounds of chanting and drums begin, faint at first, but growing louder. My grandma begins to pray, in between trying to call my grandpa. Now remember, this is a time before there were cell phones. They hear something howl outside, not a coyote howl, something more ominous and terrifying. Something is moving just beyond the reach of the porch light. Both women are beyond terrified at this point. Finally, after turbo-dialing Grandpa, he finally answers. My grandma is frantic. Something is outside the house. Get here now. For what seems like hours, they wait for Grandpa's truck to come over the hill, and finally they see the headlights. Before Grandpa flies into the driveway, something runs across the road in front of him. The headlights illuminate an animal. Something. Grandpa jumps out of the truck, yelling for the women to get the heck in the car. He unloads a couple of shots in the general vicinity of the animal, and they hit the road down the dirt track towards Grandma's house. My aunt, against her better judgment, looks back to see a pair of red eyes watching them. The next day, my grandpa and uncle head over to the house. Grandpa verified that all around the house there were bare footprints in the sand, along with very large coyote tracks. Needless to say, my aunt and grandma never went back to that house. My aunt won't even talk about it. I made the mistake of staying up too late and listening to the adults talk. My aunt moved in with my grandparents. My grandma swears that she could see those red eyes at night stalking the edge of her property. As far as I know, other people have tried living in Stoddard's house, but they all leave within a month or two. That whole area is cursed. I always hated going out there. It's an oppressive, evil feeling, even at my grandparents' house, which is a mile away. I have more stories about that cursed land involving other family members, but they will have to wait for another time. After researching and talking to my Native American friends, I'm fairly certain that what my family members had the misfortune of running into was a skinwalker. I come from a family of hunters. It was not uncommon for my mum and stepdad to go out early in the morning and not come home until well into the night on occasion. In rural Georgia, it is fairly common for landowners to lease out their acres for hunting to different folks, depending on the seasonality and the type of hunting they're doing, and deer season for archers begins at the end of summer. My mother has this story that I loved to hear as a child that, as an adult, had a horrifying twist. One afternoon, my parents struck out to go and hunt for the day. The land they leased that particular year ran alongside a power line route. These routes are clear cut through woods and create a man-made field. A hunter can set their tree stands up in the thickets surrounding these fields and wait for grazing animals to come by. Around dusk, my mum started to look out for my stepdad to come and pick her up. He would usually help get her situated in her stand, then go and find his own set-up further down the trail. As the sun began to sink, she saw him walking down through the power line clearing. My stepdad has a wide gait in his walk. He swings his arms a bit as he walks, too. I mean, it's kind of similar to a caveman to me. Even in the low sinking light, she could make out his silhouette, and she could see that he was zigzagging from side to side of the clear-cut field. He'd obviously forgotten where they had set her stand up and was trying to find her. So she stopped, she stood up and waved her hands to get his attention. At that moment, what she thought was my stepdad noticed her. It dropped down to all fours and darted into the woods, making a strange low growl as it did. She waited for what seemed like an eternity for my stepdad to come and get her. She was terrified and in tears. This was a story shared many times in my childhood when I asked for a scary hunting story. They had plenty of them. It's not that I didn't believe my mum, but we all know that the night can play tricks on us and heighten our imagination. So when I asked for this story again in my teenage years, imagine my surprise when my stepdad spoke up. A man of few words and a lack of imagination, he raised his head at the dinner table. I've never told either of you this, but I think I probably should. That night, the creature wasn't running away from your mother. I was walking along the line of the woods towards her tree stand when I noticed it. I smelled it before I actually saw the thing. It had a pungent odour, almost skunk-like, and it seemed to be a little over 6 foot tall, covered in thick, coarse hair. It saw me about the same time as I was drawing back an arrow to take aim. At first it growled, then it dropped to all fours and sprinted towards me as I released the arrow, knocking it in the arm. I was shaking and just missed the intended hit. The animal veered to the side and kept running. To this day, I wonder what that creature was. Thank you for listening, my little horrorlings. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell to find out first about new content. Give this video a like and drop me a comment below to let me know what you think of the creatures in tonight's stories. Don't forget to check beneath your bed for monsters and have sweet and pleasant dreams.